This presentation is designed to help folks who are in the planning and forming stages of their partnerships to get off to a good footing, a good start in establishing a relationship with a local public school. And what we'll be sharing today is based on our experience as a community of partnerships and congregations and church leaders and school leaders. It's also based on my own personal experience, and it's informed by research. We used to think about this journey as 10 steps. That was an earlier iteration of this presentation, but that came to feel too linear to us because we know that the way these things unfold are more meandering, a little bit more circular. So we're using a different image and talking about pathways, recognizing that some stops along the way will be encountered in different sequences and different order. By different people. We'll be talking about all of that as we get started. After the presentation, we'll have some time for questions and answers, for your comments, your observations. And we look forward to this being an interactive presentation. There'll be some materials being posted in the chat box, and in just a minute I'll ask Mary Liz to say a little bit more about that. This presentation is being posted live on Facebook Live, and it will be available through our website very shortly. Mary Liz, can you say some more about about how to use the chat box? Mary Liz is All Our Children's Director of Programming and Communications. Welcome, Mary Liz.
Thanks, Lallie. To use the chat box, you'll see a little black menu bar, probably at the top of your video window. You'll see something that says chat, and you'll see something that says Q&A. To be part of the chat, click the chat box. I would love for everybody on the call to open up your chat box and introduce yourselves there to us and to each other. You'll see a little prompt in there already. Make sure you choose all panelists and attendees as your setting in your chat so that everyone can see your questions and your observations as we go through the presentation. And during the Q&A section, you can put questions in the chat, or you can use the Q&A function. I'll be looking at both of those things. And as we go through the presentation, there'll also be a poll question that pops up for you about halfway through. That's just a way for you to interact with the material that we're presenting. And there'll also be some links to resources that show up in the chat box.
Great, thanks, Mary Liz. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to get started. So here we are. As I said a bit ago, we think of this as a roadmap, a pathway. We all, you know, Google Maps does a pretty good job of getting us directly from where we're starting to where we're ending up. But sometimes we all know that getting off the highway, meandering along, taking a little bit of a detour, responding to opportunities and sights that come up along the way is what makes the journey particularly enjoyable and instructive and fun. As we say, the journey is the destination, something like that. So, so we're going to be talking about this as a pathway. Today we're gathered together on in this presentation because we have a shared destination. We're aiming at healthy, robust, and sustainable partnerships between a congregation and a local public school. And we're going to be talking about the phases of the journey as we go through. We like this image of the traffic circle. I live in New England where we have a lot of traffic circles, and there are lots of entrances. So this journey can be begun in lots of different places. Maybe you get started because of a connection, a relationship that you or somebody in your congregation already has, maybe with the school counselor, maybe a principal, literacy coordinator, a teacher, a parent activist. So sometimes we get connected and get started through existing relationships. Maybe you are already taking action and you're ready to build it and grow it out. Maybe there's a small group, as there are in many of our participating congregations, that assemble backpacks, some of them of school supplies, some of them of food over the weekend for food insecure kids. But maybe that small group wants to get more deeply invested in the issues and of facing the kids and in the lives of the kids at the school. So maybe you're ready to take a different kind of action. Or maybe there's an issue that's come up in your broader community that you want to reflect about, that you want to learn about. Maybe your school board is considering some budget cuts, and you want to know more about what the impact of those budget cuts might be on your community and the kids in your school. Maybe you're wondering how you got to this particular situation in your own school district. What's the history behind the reality that you can observe at the moment? Maybe you want to ask yourselves, we've been doing this particular kind of relationship with the school for a while. What else might we do? How could we open our hearts and our minds to what God might be calling us to deepen into, and how we might grow and expand our relationship? So these are the three basic steps that we're going to be taking along the path. This is your itinerary, and this is the summary of this whole presentation. Everything else we'll be talking about is going to be about one of these three things. We always start by building relationships first. We are social beings. This educating our children happens in our social context. We always build relationships first. Taking thoughtful, considered action is next, because action is the oxygen of an organization and a group. Trying something on, taking a risk, being vulnerable gives us energy, and it creates spaciousness for others to come alongside and to participate. And finally, observing, learning, and reflecting, listening intentionally to school leaders, parents, teachers, others who occupy different spaces in this community. But as I said, we're going to talk about them in one at a time, but you might be encountering them in a different sequence. So let's go back and we'll go through them again more slowly, one at a time. Starting with building relationships. And we're going to start on the right-hand side of this with the why and work our way from right to left. So why build relationships? Why are relationships first? Because we're building relationships is the work. I have to remind myself of that all the time. Building relationships is not a distraction. It's not an obstacle. It's not something that gets in the way of doing the work. Building relationships is the work. And so I love this African proverb. It sustains me and grounds me and keeps me centered in the importance of this. Who do you build relationships with? You're going to start with people that you already know. And as you go talking, be listening and looking intentionally for other relationships that might open up. Ask people who else you should be talking to, who else cares about this issue, who else can you learn from. So a couple stories from our community, from our network. Outside of Buffalo, New York, the Reverend Vicky Zust and the parishioners at St. Paul's Episcopal Church decided one day to walk across the street to the Harris Hill Elementary School and just get to know them. And over the years, they have developed a rich relationship that now includes a robust tutoring program. And St. Paul's is known locally in that residential suburb as a congregation that cares about the community because of the quality of the relationship that they have with the school. A second example. In Concord, North Carolina, the Reverend Nancy Cox, the rector of All Saints Episcopal Church, accepted an invitation to a community gathering of local nonprofits, quite a different entrance point than what Vicky Zust experienced. This gathering of local nonprofits was a place where she recognized, Nancy Cox recognized, that her congregation's excess space capacity aligned and met the needs of the county because the county had a shortage of preschool programs. So they collaborated together and with other community organizations and the school district and formed a partnership that opened an early childhood education center on the grounds of All Saints Episcopal Church. So how do we get these conversations started in a way that's going to get us off on the right footing? In the chat box, I invite you to mention some ideas or some experiences that you've had that you'd like to share with others on the call today. How have you gotten started? What has been a fruitful way for you to be building relationships and getting to know teachers, activists, parents? How have you found other people who are your allies and your colleagues, whether inside your congregation or outside your congregation? And while you fill that out, I'll tell you a couple of experiences that I've had personally. I had a big turning point in my former congregation in Boston when I told our rector that a conference, an Episcopal Church conference that I had recently been to, was personally actually pretty disappointing, because I knew that public education equity was on the agenda of this conference, but to my mind, it was not addressed very seriously. There were no action items that came out of it, no sense of accountability, no sense of what I thought is a pretty compelling case for moral action, morally driven action. And so when I told her this story, she immediately said, well, she said, Lallie, I've been invited to participate in a community-wide effort right here in Boston to keep a neighborhood school open. And it's a cause that I support and that this congregation is aligned with, but I don't have time to participate. Would you like to represent us and Trinity Church and me on that team? And I said yes, absolutely, immediately, because it was exactly the kind of justice-oriented local connection that I was hungry for. And another example comes more recently from my current congregation, St. Mary's Episcopal Church here on Cape Cod, where a group of parishioners already knew about all our children when I arrived and started worshiping there. And they were interested in exploring what they might do together. This was a group whose particular interest was in economic justice, but they easily saw the connection, of course, between quality public schools and economic inequality. So our process was to talk amongst ourselves, and then we met with our rector, and then we did an adult forum and invited other people who were interested in this, in joining with us to identify themselves. And then we went and talked to the school leaders. And in collaboration with the principal and the literacy coordinator at the school, we launched our pilot project. So that was the sequence that we got started. There are two specific skills that come from the field of community organizing that we think are invaluable for people who want to build capacity and relationships around this issue in your local community. One of them, which we'll be talking about more on this presentation, is the practice of a one-on-one. A one-on-one is an intentional meeting, one person at a time. The second practice is a house meeting. And traditionally in community organizing, these are held in our homes because we can invite our friends over and our neighbors and have a different kind of conversation with a different group of people. But they can also be held at your congregation if that's what feels best for you. And Mary Liz is going to put some links to handouts on both of those two topics in our chat box now, so that you can refer to those later on. And they're both examples of how to get one of those two kinds of meetings organized and started. So I'm going to talk a little bit more now about a one-to-one, and I want to share specifically. I think this is the most powerful practice that we can cultivate as Christians in community, working for any kind of social change or justice. And the reason that I say that is that when we learn how to do a one-to-one, we develop the ability to step into conversations that feed us and that help us build and weave together relationships with others who share our passions, who want to support us, who have ideas about how to do things better or differently. And it helps to build the team and the community. So a couple things about a one-to-one. First of all, they are very intentional. They're not chatting over coffee. You ask for an intentional commitment of time that is set aside just to go have this conversation. They're short, 30 to 45 minutes. It's not a 2-hour commitment. And I want to give you an example of a story that I share with church people, because it opens up how it is for me that being a Christian influenced my commitment to education justice. And this is an example of the kind of story that when we share them with each other, it allows us to see ourselves more fully and more meaningfully. So here goes. Here's the story that I sometimes share. For 2 years, in my mid-20s, I lived outside New Haven in the town of Guilford, Connecticut. I was living with my seminarian husband, Scott, and our daughter, who was a toddler. Guilford was a town a lot like the towns that he and I both grew up in, very white and very affluent. Our household included 7 African-American teenagers from underinvested neighborhoods in the Northeast. And these neighborhoods included places like Boston's Roxbury, the South Bronx, Cleveland, North Philadelphia, West Philadelphia. The students who lived in our house over these 2 years were bright, they were motivated, they had enormous family support, and they were sponsored by a local nonprofit to attend Guilford High School to increase their chances of college success. We were the house parents, even though we were only a few years older than they were. So every night, I cooked for 10 people, and every evening, every school night, I tutored algebra sets and coached English essays. Over dinner, the students chatted about school, and we heard comments like, "It was a sea of white faces, all wearing braces." And we heard Cheryl, one of the girls, describing her personal deep determination to demonstrate to her younger siblings that education was a way for them to grow up and out of the under-resourced neighborhood where they were raised. When Scott finished seminary, after those 2 years, we left Guilford. And though we continued to live in communities of people who looked like us, in a very real way, I never went home again because I was restless. I knew that it wasn't God's dream that these girls had to leave their families and their homes to get a great education. But I also knew that it wasn't God's dream that their siblings and their friends didn't even have that option. Christians, I believed at the time, and I still believe, are called to be healers in our communities. And we are called to work for the common good, especially protecting the vulnerable, like these young people. Later, I came to believe that the unfairness in our education system is actually baked into our country's social structures, as if we intended it that way. And I was angry that my church, the Episcopal Church, was silent on what I saw to be a deep moral crisis and a community failing. And I didn't think Jesus would be silent on this issue if he walked among us. In fact, I think he'd go down to the school department and turn over some desks. So I started making choices in my life from the time that I was in my mid-20s that have kept me professionally over 40 years now at this intersection between schools, impoverished, under-resourced, disinvested neighborhoods and communities, and the church. Now, that's the end of the story that I sometimes share. So let me step back a little bit now that you've heard that story. And I invite you to reflect on how a story like that might help us connect if you and I were sitting over a cup of coffee. You learned some things about me. You learned that I was a young mom, that I was married to a seminarian. You learned that I had a privileged upbringing, that I was isolated from racial and economic diversity. Also, more importantly, I'm not sure, but also, you learned that even as a young adult in my 20s, I had a sense that being a Christian has to do with justice and fairness in our shared community public lives. Maybe as you were listening, you had something like a slideshow, your own internal slideshow going on, comparing and contrasting your own individual personal experiences and your choices with the ones that I had and the choices that I made. All that stuff often comes up when we listen to other people's personal stories like this. So if we were sitting having a cup of coffee, I would stop talking at this point, and I would ask you an open-ended question, something like, where did you first encounter unfairness in education? And then I would just listen. So connecting and building relationships is the first and fundamental part of this work. And even though we're going to move on to the next section of our traffic circle, at every step along the way, we're still building new relationships and still connecting. Taking action. So look in the poll in the chat box for a poll, and give some reflection. Answer some questions about what types of actions you think your congregation is ready to take today. It's important to take your time before you commit to a specific action. And we strongly, strongly, strongly urge you not to start with giving money. The school's needs do always need to guide our actions. And sometimes schools ask for funding because that has been what they have most frequently been able to receive from their partners. But relationships need to be at the heart of the partnership for it to be sustainable and nourishing for everybody involved. So what do we mean by considered action? In our experience, considered actions have 4 characteristics. First of all, they do respond to the school's needs. Secondly, they arise out of our community's gifts, freely offered. You know your congregations better than I do. Different congregations have different gifts, just as different individuals are. What is it that your people in your congregation love to do? What gives them joy? What do they always do? How do they always respond? That's a good clue to what your congregation's gifts are. The third characteristic of considered action is that it is sustainable over time. And I'll say a little bit more about the importance of that in a moment. Fourth, a considered action can be reconsidered. That is, the actions that you undertake can be adapted and changed in response to everybody's experience as you go forward. So when you're ready to connect with a school, we encourage you to bear in mind that a partnership, as an external partner to a school, a partnership with a school, you as partner cannot compensate for a weak or chaotic leadership in the school itself. And a weak leader will have a difficult time keeping agreements, and it will be frustrating for you and the other members of your partnership. So look for a strong leader. Meet with that leader one-on-one and invite her to be a partner. You're extending an invitation. She can choose to accept or not. We've heard stories about congregations that are eager to partner with the school, and the principal is just adamant that she doesn't want any religious groups in the building at all. And we have to respect that. Chances are it comes from experience. But inviting her to enter into a partnership with you, it's a little bit like inviting your neighbor to come over for a visit. If you want to meet a new neighbor, you don't drive your van up into her driveway and park your car there and jump out and say, "We're here to change you, we're here to help." You extend an offer of hospitality and you wait for it to be reciprocated. Of course, school leaders are responsible for the well-being of the children and the teachers in the building, so they have to check us out. It's their obligation to make sure that we won't do any harm in the building. So anticipate their concerns. These are legitimate and appropriate concerns. Anticipate their concerns about any religious group being in the building and address them right up front in your very first conversation. The top 3 points that I always make when I'm meeting with a school leader for the first time are these. I always say that we are here because we believe every child deserves a quality education. That's our primary motivation for entering into a partnership with the school. Secondly, we want to be a good neighbor. We're down the street or across town, the school and the churches, we're in the same community. We want to be a good neighbor and we're here to support the school. And third, while we are faith motivated, we do not allow our volunteers to proselytize. We never talk about religion at school, and church attendance is not a prerequisite. Now, different communities in different parts of the country, I've learned, have different social contexts. I live in the Northeast, where there is a long-standing skepticism about religion in public life. And I know that there are other parts of these great United States where that is not the case. But whatever your own context and public sort of mood is where you live, you want to anticipate the school leader's primary concerns. And in my experience, those 3 points address them. We believe every child deserves a quality education. We want to support the school, and we don't talk about religion in the school. When you are ready to meet with the principal, there's a link that Mary Liz is going to put into our chat box now with a resource about some suggestions about how to prepare yourself and how to have that conversation with your principal. Your only job in the first year of your partnership is to build trust. That's all. That's the only thing you need to do in this first year. And essentially, you're going to do that by consistently doing small things exceptionally well. This work and these relationships, it's highly dynamic, highly dynamic. As you build relationships and take action together, you're inviting more people in and you're building your capacity for future impact. For example, in my congregation up in Boston, we spent some time getting to know each other and finding ways that our interests could be expressed in the partnership with the schools. We had a couple of different schools we were in relationship with, so that when we were asked, we were able to get 50 people. It's a big congregation. We were able to get 50 people to a public action in the school auditorium with the mayor, the school superintendent, and the state treasurer of the state of Massachusetts. And this was a critical public action that actually turned a corner in our ability to keep that school open. So over time, as your connections, as your relationships, as your experience and skills grow, so will your ability to make a difference. What kinds of actions are we talking about here? Your goals are pretty simple. You want to support the school, you want to involve your congregation, and you want to be intentional and thoughtful. And within those goals, there's room for all different kinds of activities. So some people can make a long-term commitment, like tutoring an hour a week, all school year. Others might be able to help with the book sale twice a year. Some people can mentor a student, and others can help in a garden. I have two examples from our member partnerships. One from Richmond, Virginia, where St. Paul's Church developed a mentoring program and provides tutors in classrooms. They had one extraordinary volunteer who went to the annual spring fair that the summer camps in their region hosted as an information sort of promotional thing that they did to recruit campers and probably to hire their counselors as well. And she went from table to table of all these different local camps saying, "We have campers, do you have scholarships?" Then she matched the families and the kids with the type of camp that had offered a scholarship. Then she arranged transportation for these kids to get to summer camp for as long as that camp session lasted, providing a life experience that is usually not available to kids growing up in poverty in the dense inner city area of Richmond, where this partnership was. So that's one example at one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, we know a minister who spent one afternoon scrubbing bookshelves so that the school that they were in relationship with could open its library for the first time in years. So lots of different kinds of actions, room for lots of different kinds of people. Over time, maybe not until year 2 or 3, you'll be ready to look around in your neighborhood, in your wider community, and see who else cares about this issue, shares your motivation, shares your hopes, shares your vision for a high quality public education for all kids. Remembering that building relationships is the work. And here are some specific suggestions for building relationships outside your congregation. All right, back we go into the traffic circle. Every time you go around, you're still building new relationships, you're still taking specific action, and now we're going to talk about reflection. We said earlier that the most important thing to do in this first year is to build trust. Being trustworthy means sustaining your commitment over time. Stressed kids and teachers have had so many promises broken, and we do not want to be those people. So how do we stay refreshed? Well, there are 2 ways that we know of to avoid burnout. First of all, set realistic expectations. These are more likely to be process kinds of expectations than actually measurable. Though that might not always be the case, but that's more likely. For example, you are not going to see improved test scores at your school in the first year of your partnership. In fact, you will probably never be able to attribute any improvement in test scores to the fact that you are in a partnership with the school. Those measures are too complicated, and that's probably not going to happen. So don't even expect it. Don't make that a goal of your partnership. Instead, a goal you might be able to achieve is to become a trusted ally of a principal, to support parents who are looking to find some information or to express their voice before the school committee. Or, and the example that I gave earlier, to give every teacher who wants one a volunteer in her classroom for an hour a week. The second way you can avoid burnout is to stay connected, both individually and as a group, to your own deepest spiritual and personal values. Those are the ones that got you here. There's a Jewish teaching that I treasure, along with that African proverb. And the Jewish teaching is this: you are not expected to complete the task, but neither are you permitted to cease from the effort. So as I said before, I've been working on this question, on this issue for 40 years now, and it sure is not completed. But I take comfort from knowing that I can be faithful to my calling by persevering and doing what I can do where I am. We encourage you to pray at every team meeting, to learn together, and to ask your priest to add your team and your school to the weekly prayers of the people. Bless any backpacks or books that you might gather to donate. Study what the Bible says about caring for children and for other vulnerable people. Reflection. Reflection can be both about your partnership and also about the broader systemic issue of quality education in your community. So there are 3 ways to reflect on your partnership. You can capture stories and images of your partnership in action. You can gather your volunteers once or twice a year to say thank you and invite their suggestions. Oh, I misspoke. Here are the 3 ways. On the slide, you're seeing 3 different ways to reflect on your partnership. And now I'm just giving you some other suggestions. Meeting with school leaders at least once a year to tell them you appreciate their commitment, and inviting their suggestions about how to improve your partnership, what you could do differently. Here locally, we meet with our school leaders once a year at the end of the school year, and we've asked them to get feedback from the teachers before we meet with them, so that together we can make changes in our in the programming of the partnership as we decide to go together. It's helpful to make a compact together with the school. It should be very simple, a few sentences, a shared description of what you mean by success. That way you can celebrate and you can tell the story and you can promote and advertise it. As I mentioned, we had a goal of getting a volunteer for every teacher who wanted one, and we met that goal in the first full year of our partnership. When you are ready, you might want to host learning sessions at your school for the wider community about the bigger, more systemic challenges that got us to this place where education is not equally available to all kids. And because of our country's long and complex history of race prejudice, and because race and poverty are so highly correlated, we particularly encourage you to study your community's history of desegregation, if you don't already know it, and to learn about the evidence and the research around race bias at all levels of education, about the importance of teachers of color, and the other ways that race as a vector intersects with education issues. We have a whole bunch of resources that we're going to list in the chat box, and we encourage you to look into those. So that's it. That's our pathway. We're going to build relationships. We're going to take action, and we're going to be reflective, and then we're going to keep on going. I hope that this has been helpful and inspiring, and we look forward to hearing your stories and learning from you. Thanks.
Now we're going to open things up for questions. So if you have any questions on anything Lallie said, if you have any questions that you don't feel were answered, that you came hoping would get answered, now is the time to ask them. You can ask them in the chat. You can ask them through the Q&A function. I will give you a few minutes to do that while I add these links into the chat box for resources to help you learn about your local schools, as well as things that may offer you group study opportunities. Thanks, Judy. I'm also going to put a link in here to an evaluation. So even if you don't have any questions for us, we would love to hear from you about what worked about this webinar for you, what maybe you think we could do better. I'm going to put that link in the chat box right now. It's right there for you. We have a question in through Q&A from Vicki. Vicki Bethel is part of the MICA Initiative in Richmond. And she's asking if we have any ideas for getting connected with parents of children in the schools in addition to the PTA. So if you don't have access to the PTA, what are some ways to be connecting with parents of the students that you're serving? It's a great question. We are doing research now on this, Vicki.
Yeah, it's a very salient question for us. We don't have any specific answers. One of the things that we're going to be exploring in my local partnership is reaching out to other congregations. And we're going there because we know that a lot of the families whose kids go to our local school worship in other places other than the Episcopal Church locally. So we're hoping to cultivate those relationships. We also have a possibility of the school has opened for us, has indicated that they would like us to help the PTO get stronger at its recruitment and outreach. So we're trying to figure out what does that look like and what help can we offer them. But I'd love to know how other people on the call would answer that question.
Yes, if any of you on the call are having success building relationships with parents who aren't on PTAs, we would love to hear from you. Feel free to chime in the chat. I would also say your PTA probably struggles as well, which is probably part of this question, is that they are having a hard time engaging new parents. And so considering, going to the PTA and asking what their challenges are specifically. And if there are schools in your area with really strong PTAs, matching the PTAs up together to help get some new information may be a way forward. Franca is on the line and she's asking, are there specific barriers to outsiders working within a school setting that would be valuable for us to know about? What might get in the way for a church community relative to developing a connection? And outsiders is in quotes there, so I would imagine that this could be affluent churches serving schools with communities in poverty, or high color communities, and other kinds of outsider relationships. So what are the barriers?
Many communities have a local community organizing entity through one of the many community organizing networks. And if you have one in your neighborhood, I would encourage you to reach out to them and to see whether there is energy within that community around questions of public education. And the reason for that, the reason for my recommendation is that those groups are often socially and racially diverse in a way that is more reflective of our communities than many of our Episcopal churches are. And therefore it's a way for us as Episcopalians to be students of local leadership and to understand better what the issues are from the people who are most immediately affected by this challenge. And I hope I'm understanding Franca's concern there. That also could address some of the questions about how to connect with parents.
Yeah, I mean, I think too, some of the, asking what some of the concern are, if you're experiencing pushback, some of it may be mistrust.
Mm-hmm.
And finding out what are the entities that community already trusts and approaching those organizations. Sometimes they're more open than the schools because it's a less personal connection. It's an organization to organization relationship. So if there are churches in the community who aren't serving the school, but where most of the children and their parents going and talking to the pastor at that church may give you some more insight into what's been going on in the community that is leading to mistrust, and help you assess whether or not your congregation is actively listening enough, if they're hearing if they're hearing the messages that they're getting back, and then how to reflect back to the community that you're hearing what they're saying.
Judy in Richmond is saying that their new superintendent there has some ideas about connecting with parents. Judy, if you discover anything that you value, please share it with us, because we would really love to. This, as Mary Liz was saying, this is a very active research question for us that we're interested in. Also, a way back, Paul was asking if our slides are going to be available to everybody. So, Mary Liz, can you just review again how folks can access these slides afterwards?
Sure. The presentation itself will be available on our website and on Facebook. If you would like the slides, please email me directly. I'll put my email in the chat box. This isn't a presentation that we put out for the public online, but I'm happy to share the slides with individuals if they are interested in them.
Please do fill out our evaluation questionnaire. We are committed to learning from you and seeing what worked and what we might do differently going forward.
And I'll leave the line open for a couple more questions if you have them, but while we're talking about what we're doing, we do have our next webinar scheduled for Tuesday, September 25th. That will be a 30-minute live interview with Bishop Ann Hodges-Koppel of the Episcopal Diocese of North Carolina, with 15 minutes for live Q&A. And when you register for that, you're able to submit a question in advance, which we'll go through and select live, but we'll also be taking live questions. So if you don't have a question right up front, but you want to tune in and hear what her diocese is doing on education equity and how it fits in the mission of their work, we invite you to join us. I'm going to put the link to register for that session right in our chat box now. And we'll be doing a host of interviews over the fall with leaders in the Episcopal Church and also in the education equity space more broadly. And Alicia has a great suggestion here that says that she found that outside activities for students like camps, Thanksgiving dinners, Saturday activities, they have to make those a priority in your plans. And I think that those are also ways to connect with students and parents. Right. last call for any other questions. I think that we can close up. So thank you all for joining us. We're so glad that you were able to be with us today. And we hope that you will join us for a future webinar. We're working on some more web trainings for the fall, as well as this interview series. So keep in touch. If you have any resources to share on this topic that you would like us to include in our resource library, we love learning from you and our community. So please share your knowledge, share your resources. And that is how we build this movement. Thanks again for joining us, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.